The stars outside the viewport were cold and silent, just like the man who stood watching them. Commander Kale Morrow had not slept in 31 hours. This was not unusual. Sleep was a thing he allowed his body when there was nothing left to do, and there was always something left to do. Right now, he was counting the ships docked at Lethania Accord, a massive neutral space station that floated between 3-star systems like a metal island in an ocean of black. 14 ships, 2 of them military. One was his. He pressed his thumb against the cold glass of the viewport and held it there until the warmth of his skin left a small fog mark. Then he pulled his hand away and watched the mark disappear. That was the thing about space. It took everything back eventually. Kale was 44 years old. He had been a soldier since he was 19. 25 years of service to Earth's United Void Command. 25 years of walking into rooms where things wanted to kill him and walking out again while they did not. His record was clean, decorated, and long. He had fought in the Crucible Wars against the Vorath hegemony, a series of brutal conflicts that had stretched across 6 years and 11 star systems. He had led the defense of Titan when the orbital stations fell. He had walked through plasma fire on Reach IV to pull 2 wounded soldiers from a collapsed bunker. The burns on his left shoulder still ached when the air pressure changed. The galaxy knew his name, not because he was loud or famous in the way politicians were famous. The galaxy knew his name because he was the kind of human that made other species nervous. The Dalkari warlords, who stood 8 feet tall and had claws that could tear through ship plating, had once refused to negotiate with Earth's diplomatic corps. So Earth Command sent Kale. He sat across from the Dalkari war chief in a room that smelled like iron and said nothing. He just looked at the war chief with those steady, flat gray eyes and waited. The negotiation lasted 11 minutes. The Dalkari signed everything. They called him the Unmoved. It was not a name he had chosen. It was a name that had grown around him the way moss grows on stone slowly, naturally, because the conditions were right. Kale Morrow did not flinch. He did not panic. He did not raise his voice. He moved through violence and chaos the way a river moves through rock, and when it was over, he was still there, always still there. Humans had a reputation in the galaxy, and it was built on people like him. Other species were stronger. The Torvathi had better reflexes. The Vorath had thicker skin and bones like iron bars, but none of them could do what humans did. None of them could keep going. A Torvathi soldier who survived 3 combat deployments was considered a veteran. A human soldier who survived 3 combat deployments was considered mid-career. The galaxy's psychologists had studied it for decades and still could not fully explain it. Humans broke every model. They endured things that should have destroyed them, and then they woke up the next morning and made coffee and did it again. It was terrifying, even to their allies. Kale turned away from the viewport when his communicator buzzed. The message was from Earth Command and it was short. His new assignment. He read it twice and then a third time because he was certain there had been a mistake. Diplomatic escort. The Velani cultural delegation aboard Lethania Accord. Duration, 3 weeks. Objective, ensure the safety of the Velani emissary during treaty negotiations. He closed the message and stood very still for a long moment. Then he said a single word under his breath that would not be appropriate to repeat: babysitting. They were pulling him off the front lines to babysit. The Velani were a gentle species, small, slender, with pale blue skin and bioluminescent markings that shifted color with their emotions. They were known across the galaxy as healers and mediators. They had no military. They had no weapons. They solved conflicts by talking, and when talking failed, they solved conflicts by feeling. The Velani were empaths. They could sense the emotional states of other beings through proximity, and through physical touch. They could actually soothe pain, not just physical pain, but the deeper kind. The kind that lived in the mind. Kale had never met a Velani. He had no interest in meeting one now. He was a soldier. His place was on the line in the dark, doing the work that lets softer people sleep at night. But orders were orders, and Kale Morrow followed orders. He arrived at the delegation's quarters at exactly the scheduled time. The Veleni had been given a section of the station that was warm and filled with a soft blue light that mimicked their homeworld's atmosphere. It smelled faintly of something sweet, like flowers after rain. Kale stood in the doorway in his tactical armor and felt completely out of place, like a piece of broken metal dropped into a garden. There were 4 Veleni in the room. 3 of them looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. The 4th had her back to him. She was standing near the far wall, her fingers resting lightly on a tablet, her bioluminescent markings glowing a soft, steady white. She was taller than the others. Not tall by human standards, but tall for a Veleni. Her movements were slow and careful, like someone who was always paying attention to everything around her. "Commander Morrow," one of the aides said, stepping forward with a small bow, "we are grateful for your protection. This is Emissary Lurie." The tall Veleni turned around. Kale had looked into the eyes of warlords and killers and things that crawled out of dark places between stars. None of them had made him feel anything. But when Lurie looked at him, something in her expression changed. Her bioluminescent markings, which had been a calm white, flickered. They shifted through pale blue, then violet, then settled on a color Kale did not recognize, something deep and quiet and sad, like the sky just before night falls completely. Her aide noticed it too and looked confused. Kale saw the aide glance at Lurie with a question in his eyes, but Lurie did not explain. She simply looked at Kale for a long, quiet moment, the way someone looks at a building that is still standing after a terrible storm, not with admiration, but with a kind of aching recognition of what the standing had cost. Then she bowed her head gently and said, "Thank you for coming, Commander." Her voice was soft, her eyes were kind, and something about the way she looked at him made Kale want to leave the room immediately. He did not leave. He straightened his back, clasped his hands behind him, and said, "Delegate, I'll need a full briefing on your schedule and any known threats." Professional, distant, efficient, the armor held. But as he turned to inspect the room's entry points, he could feel her eyes still on him. And for the first time in a very long time, Kale Morrow had the uncomfortable feeling that someone was looking at something he had spent 25 years making sure no one could see. 3 days into the assignment, Kale had mapped every corridor, exit, ventilation shaft, and maintenance hatch within 200 meters of the Veleni quarters. He had memorized the patrol schedules of the station's security forces. He had identified 11 individuals on the station whose backgrounds flagged as potentially hostile, and he had quietly forwarded their names to Earth Command for further review. He had also not had a single real conversation with anyone. This was normal. Kale did not do conversations. He did briefings. He did reports. He did status updates and tactical assessments. When the Veleni aides tried to make small talk with him during meals, he answered in short sentences and then excused himself to check something that did not need checking. When the station's other human personnel, a small team of engineers and a medical officer, invited him to eat with them, he declined. He ate alone in his quarters, standing up, because sitting down to eat felt like wasting time. Lurie watched all of this. She did not say anything about it, but she watched. The Veleni emissary had a schedule that was full from morning to evening. Meetings with representatives from 6 different species, cultural presentations, treaty discussions about the proposed exchange program that would allow Veleni empathic healers to work in human space, particularly among military veterans. It was this last point that had drawn the most attention and the most resistance. The idea was simple. Humans were the galaxy's best soldiers, but even the best soldiers came home carrying things they could not put down. Earth's own mental health systems were overwhelmed and had been for decades. The Veleni were offering something no human technology could replicate. The ability to reach into a person's pain and ease it, not with drugs or machines, but with presence and touch, and a kind of emotional precision that human science still could not fully explain. Many in the galaxy thought the program was pointless. Humans did not need that kind of help. They were the species that adapted to everything. They lived on frozen moons and in orbital stations with recycled air, and under the crushing gravity of colony worlds that would flatten most other species. They watched their friends die and then completed the mission. They were, in the words of a Torvathi academic paper, psychologically anomalous to a degree that borders on the disturbing. Why would they need Velani healers? Lurie knew why. She had known from the moment she looked at Kale Morrow. The Velani did not read minds. That was a common misunderstanding. What they sensed was emotional energy, the residue of feeling that every living being carried with them like heat from a fire. Most species had emotional signatures that were layered and shifting like weather. Happy on the surface, worried underneath, calm at the core. It was normal. It was alive. Kale's emotional signature was unlike anything Lurie had ever encountered. It was not layered. It was compressed. Imagine taking every feeling a person had ever experienced, every grief, every rage, every moment of loneliness and fear and desperate hope, and pressing it down into a space so small and so dense that it became something else entirely. Something structural, something load-bearing. His pain was not sitting on top of him. It was woven into the foundation of who he was. Every calm decision he made, every steady hand, every moment of legendary composure, all of it was built on top of a suffering so deep that he had forgotten it was there, the same way a person forgets the sound of their own heartbeat. He had not suppressed his trauma, he had become it, and the galaxy called this strength. On the fourth day, Lurie attended a meeting with the Torvathi ambassador, a tall female named Shurth who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service. Shurth was polite and intelligent, and during a break in the meeting, she sat beside Lurie near the observation lounge and said something that stayed with the Velani emissary for a long time. "We admire the humans," Shurth said, her deep voice quiet. "My people respect strength, and the humans have a kind of strength that we cannot match, but I will tell you something I have never said publicly." She paused and looked out at the stars. "We also pity them. They are the galaxy's greatest survivors. They endure what no one else can endure. But I sometimes wonder, has anyone ever asked them what surviving costs? Has anyone ever sat beside a human and said, 'You do not have to carry this alone'? I do not think they would know what to do if someone did." Lurie thought about Kale standing in the doorway of her quarters that first day, his back straight, his eyes flat, his armor holding everything in place. She thought about the way he checked perimeters at 3 in the morning and 8 standing up and called her delegate instead of her name because names were personal, and personal was dangerous. "No," Lurie said softly, "I do not think they would." That night the station's alarm screamed. The atmospheric systems in the Velani quarters had been sabotaged. A toxic compound had been introduced into the air filtration, something that was harmless to most species but lethal to Velani biology within minutes. The lights went red. The air turned sharp and wrong. Lurie's aides began to choke, their bioluminescent markings flashing in panic. Kale was there in 40 seconds. He came through the door like something made of stone and purpose, his weapon up, his eyes scanning. He grabbed Lurie and her aides and moved them into the corridor so fast that Lurie's feet barely touched the ground. Then he sealed the quarters behind them and turned to face the 3 figures that came around the corner, armed, masked, moving with military coordination. The fight lasted 11 seconds. Kale did not shout. He did not hesitate. He moved the way water moves when a dam breaks fast, inevitable, without wasted motion. The first attacker went down with a broken arm. The second hit the wall so hard that the metal dented behind him. The third managed to fire one shot that scorched the plating above Kale's head before a precise strike to the throat put him on the floor. 11 seconds, 3 bodies, silence. Kale stood over them, breathing evenly. His heart rate, if anyone had checked, was barely elevated. He turned to the Velani, checked each of them for injuries with quick, efficient hands, and then activated his communicator to report the incident. Lurie stood against the corridor wall, still coughing from the tainted air, and watched him. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. His face showed nothing, not anger, not fear, not satisfaction. Nothing. As if what had just happened was no different from walking through a door or checking a schedule. The station's security team arrived minutes later and took the attackers into custody. Medical staff checked the Veleni. Reports were filed. The corridor slowly emptied. Cale stayed. He stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed, watching the last of the security team leave. His armor had a scorch mark on the left shoulder plate from the shot that had missed his head by inches. He did not seem to notice. Lurie approached him slowly. Her bioluminescent markings were dim. She was exhausted and shaken, but her eyes were steady. "Commander," she said quietly, "are you all right?" He looked at her. "The threat has been neutralized. I'll have additional security posted within the hour." "That is not what I asked." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'm fine, delegate," and walked away. Lurie watched him go. His steps were even. His posture was perfect. His hands did not shake. And that, she realized, was the most frightening thing she had ever seen in her life. Not the violence, not the speed, not the cold precision with which he had dismantled 3 armed attackers in the time it took to draw a breath. What frightened her was the absence. The vast, echoing nothing where a reaction should have been. He had nearly died, and his body did not even consider it worth remembering. She pressed her hand against the wall and felt the cold metal under her fingers. Somewhere deep inside the station, the air recyclers hummed back to life. Somewhere down the corridor, Cale Morrow was already checking the next perimeter. And Lurie made a quiet decision. She was going to find out what was underneath all that armor. Not because it was her mission, not because the treaty required it, but because she had felt what was inside him, that compressed, suffocating, enormous weight, and she knew, with the certainty of her species, that no living thing was meant to carry that much alone. The investigation began the next morning. Station security had identified the 3 attackers as agents connected to a splinter faction within the Vorath hegemony, a group that did not want the Veleni-human alliance to happen. The Vorath had fought humans in the Crucible Wars and lost badly. A formal peace existed, but peace on paper and peace in the heart were different things. There were Vorath who still hated humans, and there were Vorath who feared what would happen if the galaxy's most relentless species gained access to Veleni healing. A human military that was not only unbreakable in body, but also whole in mind. That was a nightmare some Vorath could not accept. Cale threw himself into the investigation the way he threw himself into everything, completely and without rest. He reviewed security footage for hours. He cross-referenced passenger manifests. He interviewed station personnel with the kind of quiet intensity that made people answer questions they had not planned to answer. This was familiar ground. This was tactical. This was war in a different shape, and war was the only language his nervous system still spoke with any fluency. Lurie requested to accompany him. She argued that her empathic abilities could detect hostile intent among the station's residents, that she could feel the sharp, metallic edge of someone who meant to do harm, even if their face showed nothing. Cale refused. He told her it was a security risk. She told him it was a tactical advantage. He told Earth Command it was unnecessary. Earth Command told him to accept. So now they were together, walking the corridors, sitting across from suspects in small interview rooms, moving through the station's market level where 100 species traded and talked and watched each other with careful eyes. Cale did not like it. He was used to operating alone or with soldiers who understood that silence was a professional courtesy. Lurie was neither alone nor silent. She existed beside him with a quiet warmth that he found deeply unsettling, like standing next to an open fire when you had spent so long in the cold that you had forgotten warmth was a real thing. She did not push. This was the part that confused him. She did not ask him about the Crucible Wars. She did not ask about his family or his past or why he slept 4 hours a night and spent the other 20 working. She asked him small things, strange things, things that had nothing to do with the mission. "What does rain feel like?" she asked one morning as they walked through the station's upper level. Her voice was casual, as if the question had simply occurred to her. Cale glanced at her. "Wet." "I know it is wet. I mean, what does it feel like? To a human. I have read that your species finds comfort in rain, that you will stand outside in it on purpose. My people find this very strange. Water falling from above seems like something one should avoid." Cale was quiet for several steps. Then he said, "It depends on the rain. Light rain feels like the air is touching you everywhere at once. Heavy rain feels like the world is washing itself." He said it without thinking, and then immediately wished he had not said it because it was not the kind of thing he said. It was the kind of thing a person said, and he was not a person right now. He was a security detail. Lurie did not react to the answer in any obvious way. She simply nodded and said, "That is beautiful," and kept walking. She asked him other things over the following days. What do humans dream about? Do humans really laugh when they are afraid? Is it true that human children cry when they are happy? Each question was small and light, like a pebble tossed into a deep lake. And each time Cale answered a little more than he intended to. He did not know why. Perhaps it was because the questions were not about him specifically. They were about humans, about his species. And talking about humans in general was safe, in a way that talking about himself was not. But Lurie was patient, and the distance between humans and Cale grew a little shorter each day. Meanwhile, the cultural exchange pilot program had begun on the station. A small group of Veleni healers had started working with human military personnel who had volunteered for the program. Most of the volunteers were skeptical. They came because Earth Command had encouraged it, or because they were curious, or because someone had dared them. What happened next became the most talked-about event on Lethania Accord. A Marine named Sergeant Dara Voss, 12 years of service, 4 combat deployments, a reputation for being the loudest and toughest person in any room, sat down across from a Veleni healer named Torin. Torin was small and quiet and had markings that glowed a gentle gold. He asked Voss to place her hands on the table, palms up, and to think about whatever came to mind. Voss laughed and said she was thinking about lunch. Torin placed his fingertips lightly on her palms. His markings shifted color: blue, then violet, then a deep, shuddering red. His eyes widened. He did not pull away, but his hands trembled. Voss stopped laughing. "What is it?" she asked, her voice suddenly different, smaller. Torin looked at her with an expression that was hard to name. It was not pity. It was something closer to the face a person makes when they open a door expecting an empty room and find it filled, floor to ceiling, with things that should not have fit inside. "You carry so much," he said softly. "How do you carry so much?" Sergeant Dara Voss, who had held a defensive position for 18 hours on a frozen moon while her squad was cut in half around her, who had laughed off a shrapnel wound to her leg and walked 3 kilometers to extraction, who had not cried since she was 11 years old, broke. She did not break loudly. That was not how it happened with humans. It started with her jaw tightening, then her eyes going wet, then her shoulders pulling inward as if something inside her chest was collapsing. And then the tears came, and they came like the rain Cale had described, not light and gentle but heavy, the kind that washes the world. 15 years. She had been carrying it for 15 years. The faces of the people she had lost. The sound of the rescue shuttle that arrived 6 minutes too late on Callisto. The way she had smiled at the memorial service, because soldiers do not cry at memorial services. They stand straight and they nod and they say they were good people, and then they go back to their quarters and sit in the dark and do not sleep. All of it came out in that small, warm room on Lethania Accord, with a tiny alien's fingertips resting on her palms. The Veleni healers were shaken afterward. Not because the pain was unfamiliar. Every species had pain. What shook them was the duration. How long these humans had carried these wounds without treatment, without acknowledgement, without ever once believing they were allowed to set the weight down. It was as if the entire species had collectively agreed that enduring pain in silence was the price of being strong, and they had been paying it so long that they no longer recognized it as a cost. A naval engineer named Tors admitted she had not slept without nightmares since the siege of Callisto, 3 years ago. A communications officer named Park said he sometimes forgot what his own laughter sounded like. A young pilot named Chen said she flinched at loud noises, but had trained herself to hide the flinch so well that no one had ever noticed. The Velani healer who worked with Chen said later, very quietly, to her colleagues, she was more afraid of being seen flinching than she was of the thing that made her flinch. None of the Velani had words for this. Their language had no term for a wound that the wounded person refuses to call a wound. Kale heard about the sessions. He did not comment, but one evening, walking back to his quarters after a late security review, he passed the room where the healing sessions were held. The door was open. Inside, a human soldier, a young man Kale did not recognize, was sitting in a chair with his face in his hands, sobbing. Lurie was kneeling beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her bioluminescent markings glowing a soft and steady blue. She was not speaking. She was simply there, present and warm and unhurried, as if she had nowhere else in the universe to be except beside this breaking person. Kale stopped in the doorway. He did not enter. He did not make a sound. But something behind his eyes shifted. It was not a crack. Not yet. It was something deeper and slower, like the first movement of stone after centuries of stillness, a grinding, tectonic shift in something he had believed was permanent. He left before Lurie could see him. He walked to his quarters and sat on the edge of his bunk and stared at the wall for a long time. His hands were still. His breathing was even. His face showed nothing. But deep inside the architecture of who Kale Morrow had built himself to be, something had moved. And things that move, no matter how slowly, eventually reach a place they were not before. He did not sleep that night. But for the first time in years, the reason was not the mission. The reason was something he could not name, and that frightened him more than any enemy ever had. The second attack came on the 14th day, and it was not a sabotage. It was an assault. 12 Vorath shock troops breached Lethani Accord through a maintenance docking port on the station's lower ring. They moved fast and coordinated, cutting through 2 security checkpoints before the station's alarms even sounded. Their target was the Velani delegation. Their orders, as recovered later from encrypted communications, were simple. Kill the emissary, destroy the treaty, send a message that the galaxy would not forget. Kale was in the security office reviewing surveillance feeds when the first explosion shook the station. The lights flickered, the floor trembled. Then the alarms began, a deep, pulsing sound that Kale had heard 1,000 times before, and his body responded before his mind did. Weapon in hand, armor sealed, moving. He reached the corridor outside the Velani quarters in under 2 minutes. The station's security team was scattered, some responding to a decoy explosion on the upper ring, others pinned down near the maintenance port. The Vorath had planned this well. They had created chaos to divide the defenders, and then sent their best through the gap. Kale found the first 2 Vorath soldiers at the junction point, 30 meters from the Velani quarters. They were big, the Vorath always were. Thick gray skin, armored plates along their spines, hands like industrial tools. They saw him and raised their weapons. He did not slow down. The fight in the corridor was something that the station's security cameras recorded, and that was later watched by military analysts from 11 different species. It became one of those pieces of footage that got passed around in quiet rooms and private channels, the kind of thing that officers showed their recruits when they wanted to explain what humans were capable of, when there was something behind them worth protecting. Kale fought the way a storm moves through a valley, not with rage, not with desperation, but with a relentless, systematic, almost mechanical precision that was more frightening than any display of anger could have been. He used the corridor's narrow width to his advantage, forcing the Vorith to come at him in pairs rather than in a group. He broke the first one's weapon arm with a strike that used the soldier's own momentum against him. He put the second into the wall with a shoulder charge that cracked the Vorith's chest plate. Then 4 more came around the corner, and Kale held his ground. He held it for 9 minutes. 9 minutes is not a long time when you are sitting in a chair reading about it. 9 minutes is an eternity when you are standing in a metal corridor with blood in your mouth and 4 heavily armed soldiers trying to kill you. The Vorith were strong and trained and motivated by hatred, and they did not stop coming. Kale took hits, a strike to his ribs that he felt crack something inside his armor, a plasma round that burned through his left arm guard and scorched the skin beneath, a blow to his helmet that split his lip and filled his mouth with copper. He did not stop. He did not retreat. He did not call for help, because calling for help would mean leaving the corridor open, and behind him was a door, and behind that door were 4 Veleni who had never held a weapon in their lives. By the time the station's security reinforcements arrived, Kale had put down 8 of the 12 attackers. The remaining 4 had been intercepted by a secondary team at the maintenance port. The corridor was scorched and dented and painted with the evidence of violence. Kale stood at the center of it, breathing hard, his armor cracked in 3 places, blood running from his lip and from the burn on his arm. The security team leader, a Torvathi named Vren, stopped at the end of the corridor and stared. She had seen many things in her career. She had never seen one person hold a position alone against 12 shock troops for 9 minutes. She said something in Torvathi that did not translate well, but the closest meaning was, "What are you?" Kale wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and said, "Is the delegation secure?" "Yes." "Then I need a medical kit and a damage report." He said it the way someone might ask for a glass of water, as if what had just happened was simply the next item on a checklist. Vren stared at him for a long moment, then turned to her team and quietly said, "Get him whatever he needs." The medical team came. Kale let them patch the burn on his arm and tape his cracked ribs. He refused painkillers. He refused rest. He stood in the corridor and filed his report while the medical officer worked on him, dictating details into his communicator with the same flat, steady voice he always used. But this time, something was different. His hands were shaking. It was small, so small that no one noticed except Kale himself, a faint tremor in his fingers, barely visible like the vibration of a wire pulled too tight for too long. He looked down at his hands and watched the tremor and did not understand it. He had been in worse fights. He had taken worse injuries. He had been closer to death more times than he could count. His hands had never shaken before. Something was wrong with his armor, not the metal one, the other one. He went to the med bay because the medical officer insisted on a full scan of his ribs. The med bay was crowded. The attack had produced casualties across the station. Humans and aliens lay on beds and sat in chairs, being treated for burns and cuts and broken bones and shock. Luri was there. She stood near the far wall, her hands moving gently over the arm of a wounded Torvathi guard, her bioluminescent markings dim with exhaustion. She had been healing for hours, pouring her empathic energy into the wounded, easing pain, calming the fear that came after violence. Her movements were slow, and Kale could see that she was running on almost nothing. The Veleni had limits. They gave their own energy when they healed, and Luri had given nearly all of hers. She looked up and saw him in the doorway. He was a terrible sight, cracked armor, blood on his face and hands, the burn on his arm still raw beneath its bandage, carbon scoring across his chest plate from plasma rounds that had come close enough to leave marks. He stood the way he always stood, straight, solid, present, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something unsteady, something that looked like a wall with a crack running through it. Lurie stopped what she was doing. She said something quietly to the Torvathi guard, who nodded. Then she walked across the med bay toward Kale. The room was full of people, but it went quiet. Not silent. There was still the hum of medical equipment and the soft sounds of the wounded, but the conversation stopped. The humans and aliens in the room looked up and watched as the small Veleni emissary walked toward the bloodied human commander who had just held a corridor alone against an army. She stopped in front of him. She was shorter than him by nearly a foot. Her markings were so dim they were almost invisible. She was exhausted and drained, and she looked as fragile as glass. She did not speak. She did not use her empathic abilities. She did not try to heal him or read him or do anything that her species was known for. She simply reached out and softly brushed her hand against his. It was the smallest gesture in the universe, fingertips against the back of his hand, a touch so light it barely registered on the skin. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Kale's jaw tightened. The muscle in his cheek jumped. His breathing, which had been steady and controlled through 9 minutes of combat, hitched. Just once. A single, involuntary stutter in the rhythm of a man who had not allowed himself an involuntary anything in 25 years. And then his eyes changed. The flat gray steadiness that the galaxy knew and feared cracked open, and behind it was something vast and old and suffocating. The weight of every mission, every loss, every friend he had buried, every night he had spent staring at ceilings in dark rooms on ships between stars. His brother's face, drifting in the vacuum after the hull breach on the Meridian 22 years ago. The way the comms had gone silent one by one during the retreat from Titan. The smell of the medical bay on Reach IV, where he had sat beside a dying soldier and held her hand and told her she was going to be fine, knowing she was not, and then walked out and completed the mission, because the mission did not stop for grief. All of it right there, right behind his eyes, visible for the first time to anyone who was looking. A single tear tracked down through the grime and blood on his face. He did not wipe it away. He did not move. He stood perfectly still, with a Veleni woman's fingertips resting against his hand, and for one long, terrible, beautiful moment, he was not the unmoved. He was not a weapon or a wall or a legend. He was a man who had been carrying the weight of the world for so long that he had forgotten he was carrying it. Across the room, Torvathi Ambassador Shurth watched from her chair where a medic was wrapping a minor wound on her arm. Her aide stood beside her, also watching. The aide whispered, "I thought nothing could break them." Shurth shook her head slowly. Her eyes were wet, and she did not care who saw it. "I was wrong about them," she said quietly. "They are not the galaxy's greatest survivors because nothing breaks them. They are the greatest survivors because everything does, and they get back up anyway." Kale breathed in and out. The tear dried on his face. Lurie's hand stayed where it was, light, warm, asking nothing. Then he closed his eyes just for a second, and when he opened them again, the wall was back in place, cracked but standing, always standing. He looked down at Lurie. She looked up at him. Neither of them spoke. Then Kale nodded once, very slightly, and turned to let the medical officer finish the scan on his ribs. His hands were still shaking, but he did not hide them this time. It was a small thing, but small things, it turned out, could shatter armor that plasma fire could not touch. The Vorath conspiracy collapsed within a week. Station security, working alongside Earth Command intelligence and Veleni empathic interrogators, traced the attack back to a rogue military cell operating without the knowledge of the Vorath hegemony's official government. The hegemony, desperate to avoid another war with humanity, publicly condemned the attack, executed the cell's leadership, and issued a formal apology to both the Veleni delegation and Earth Command. It was messy and political, and filled with the kind of careful language that governments use when they are terrified, but it was over. The treaty was signed on a Tuesday. It was a simple ceremony held in the station's central atrium, a wide open space with a transparent ceiling that looked out at the stars. Representatives from 9 species attended. The Velani delegation stood on one side, their bioluminescent markings glowing a steady, peaceful white. The human diplomatic team stood on the other, dressed in formal uniforms that looked stiff and uncomfortable on people who were more used to tactical gear. Lurie signed for the Velani. A human ambassador named Akoro signed for Earth. They pressed their hands to the document, a physical gesture the Velani had insisted on, because to them, touch made things real, and it was done. The Velani Empathic Healing Exchange Program was officially approved. Velani healers would begin working in human space within 6 months, starting with military installations and veteran support centers. It was a quiet moment. There was no applause, no celebration. The Torvathi ambassador, Shurth, watched from the second-level balcony and later wrote in her personal journal that it was the most important treaty she had witnessed in 30 years, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. For the first time in its history among the stars, humanity had asked for help, not military aid, not resources or technology or strategic alliance. Help. The kind that required admitting you were hurt. Shurth wrote, "I have seen species conquer worlds and lose them, build empires and watch them fall. But I have never seen anything as brave as what the humans did today. They signed a piece of paper that said, 'We are not unbreakable.' And then they stood there in front of 9 species and did not look away." In the days that followed, Kale continued his duties on the station while the delegation prepared to depart. He was quieter than usual, which was saying something for a man who had never been loud. The other humans on the station noticed a change in him, though none of them could have described it precisely. It was not that he was softer. He was still Kale Morrow. He still checked perimeters and reviewed security logs and moved through the station with the calm, measured stride of a man who was always ready for the next threat. But there were small differences. He sat down when he ate. He slept 5 hours instead of 4. When the human medical officer asked him how his ribs were healing, he said, "Slowly," instead of "fine." These were tiny things, but tiny things were how the universe changed. Earth Command sent him new orders on the 18th day, a return to frontline command. The Outer Reach Patrol needed experienced officers, and Kale's name was at the top of every list. It was the kind of assignment he would have accepted without hesitation a month ago. The front line was where he belonged. The front line was where he made sense. He read the orders 3 times. Then he sat in his quarters for a long time, looking at nothing. The next morning, he sent a reply to Earth Command. It was 4 sentences long. He declined the frontline assignment. He requested reassignment to the Velani Human Cultural Exchange Program as a security liaison and military advisor. He said he believed his experience and expertise would serve Earth's interests more effectively in this capacity. He did not say the real reason, because the real reason was not the kind of thing you put in an official request. Earth Command was surprised. His commanding officer called him directly on a secure channel and asked if he was serious. Kale said yes. His commanding officer asked if he was all right. Kale said yes again. There was a long pause, and then his commanding officer said, "Understood, Commander," in a voice that suggested he did not understand at all but knew better than to argue with Kale Morrow. The news spread through the station and then through the fleet. The unmoved had stepped off the front line. The man who had held a corridor alone against 12 shock troops, who had stared down Dalkari warlords, who had walked through plasma fire without flinching, that man had requested a transfer to a cultural exchange program. People did not know what to make of it. Some thought he was broken. Some thought he was tired. Some thought it was a classified cover for something else. Shurth, when she heard, simply smiled and said nothing. The Velani delegation departed Lethani Accord on a cool, quiet morning. The station's docking bay was nearly empty. Kale stood at the observation window and watched the Velani transport prepare for departure. He would be following on a separate ship in 3 days, once his transfer paperwork was finalized. Lurie found him there. She walked up beside him and stood in the blue-white light of the docking bay, her markings glowing softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just watched the transport crew loading supplies through the viewport, moving in the slow, careful way that people move in low gravity. "You did not have to do this," Lurie said finally. "The transfer, you did not have to." "I know. The front line is where you have always been." "I know that too." She turned to look at him. He was still watching the viewport, his profile sharp and still against the light. The scorch mark on his shoulder plate had been repaired, but if you looked closely, you could see where the metal was slightly different in color. A scar. The kind that stays even after the wound is closed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He turned to her. His gray eyes were steady, but there was something in them now that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Not softness exactly, more like depth, as if a door had been opened in a room that had been sealed for a very long time, and light was beginning to reach places that had not seen it in years. "What changed?" she asked. Cale looked at her for a long time. The docking bay hummed around them. Stars burned silently outside the viewport. Somewhere on the station, a group of human veterans were sitting in a room with Veleni healers, learning for the first time that putting down the weight did not mean they were weak. Somewhere in the fleet, officers were reading Cale's transfer request and trying to understand it. Somewhere in the galaxy, a Torvathi ambassador was writing in her journal about bravery and paper, and the look on a human's face when he decides to stop pretending he is not hurt. "You didn't try to take the armor off," Cale said quietly. His voice was low and rough and honest in a way that cost him something to produce. "You just showed me I was still in there, underneath it." Lurie's markings shifted, a slow wave of color moving from white to a deep, warm gold that Cale had never seen before. She did not translate what it meant, and he did not ask. She reached out and touched his hand again, not a brush this time. She placed her fingers against his and held them there, and he let her. They stood like that for a while, two people from different worlds, in the quiet space between stars. 3 months later, the Veleni published their first comprehensive study on human psychology to the Galactic academic networks. The paper was authored by Lurie and a team of 12 Veleni researchers who had spent the preceding months working with human veterans, civilians, and military personnel across 4 installations. It was titled On the Structural Paradox of Emotional Endurance in Homo sapiens, and within a week of its publication, it had been accessed by researchers from every known species in the galaxy. The paper was long and detailed and filled with data, but its conclusion was what resonated. It was translated into 47 languages. It was quoted in diplomatic speeches and academic lectures, and in quiet conversations between people who had always wondered about the strange, stubborn, impossible species from the third planet of an unremarkable yellow star. The conclusion read, "Humans do not survive because they do not break. Humans survive because they break constantly, silently, catastrophically, and they rebuild themselves before anyone notices. They have mistaken this for strength. It is, in fact, the most profound act of courage we have ever documented in any species. The bravest thing a human ever does is not fighting. It is not enduring. It is not surviving against odds that would crush any other being in the known galaxy. The bravest thing a human ever does is allowing someone to be gentle with them." The galaxy read it, and for the first time in the long, complicated history of humanity's relationship with the stars, the other species did not look at humans with fear or with admiration or with the cautious respect that one gives to a dangerous animal. They looked at them with something much simpler and much harder to earn. They looked at them with understanding. And somewhere on a small station orbiting a blue-white star, a man who had once been called the Unmoved sat across from a woman whose skin glowed like moonlight, and he told her about the rain.